Republicans in domestic war.
President Bush did it in the Gulf War. We work better when we are unified.
UN hypocrisy gets hysterical. Saudi Arabia is appointed to the UN Rights Panel.
Israel's security woes.
Republicans in domestic war. The United States has never experienced so many primetime political debates as it has recently, and they're all happening together. The presidential race, Iran nuclear deal discussions, and the government shutdown fears.
President Bush did it in the Gulf War. We work better when we are unified. We can be strong as a country, and we can project across this globe with unity, not just doing it alone. That is not what gets us where we want to get as a nation.
You know, really, there's been a leftward shift in public consciousness, so that really more and more people today recognize that the two political parties in this country, they're both working for the same people, the 1%, the corporate rulers.
The Republicans are in fact at war with each other, not only over typical issues, but also over how best to stand up to President Obama. At the heart of their current debates lies the Planned Parenthood, a non-profit organization that provides reproductive health as well as maternal and child health services. The Republicans have vowed to prevent any funds to this organization that had become the target of controversy over a video that shows its staff engaged in acts of misconduct.
Anyone who has watched this videotape, I dare Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama to watch these tapes. Watch a fully formed fetus on the table, its heart beating, its legs kicking, while someone says we have to keep it alive to harvest its brain. This is about the character of our nation. And if we will not stand up and force President Obama to veto this bill, shame on us.
The Republicans' failure to allocate a funding extension for Planned Parenthood will prompt a government shutdown. President Obama has already urged them to set aside brinkmanship and quickly allocate the funds to prevent the closure of his administration.
There is nothing principled about the idea of another government shutdown. There's nothing patriotic about denying the progress you've worked so hard to make. America is great right now. Not because of our government, or our wealth, or our power, but because of everyone who works hard every day to move this country forward. Now Congress needs to work as hard as you do. Thanks, and have a great weekend.
The current infighting will not be without victims. Many are already criticizing the House Speaker, John Boehner, for losing control over his party, and are speculating that he will soon be toppled.
The conservative policies of the Republicans have unleashed that racist rank and file, and they're profoundly dissatisfied with the compromises forced on them by the leadership. I don't think that one of the Tea Party types would succeed Boehner, though, because again, the leaders of the Republican Party understand that that right-wing politics will not elect, will not get them into the presidency. They have to appeal to, some center votes. So I think it would be, another centrist from within the party that would succeed Boehner.
Another interesting twist. The Democrats are happy to see the dispute among the Republicans. They're banking on presidential candidate Donald Trump to drive this among their congressional rivals. Trump has promised a lavish tax reforms plan, as well as an extended budget spending among many other things, if he gets the ticket to the office. The billionaire candidate has been doing perfectly in recent opinion polls, and this may have already added to the concerns that Trump will eventually bring down the Senate Republicans by creating a climate of doubt among voters and give the Democrats a chance to reign again once next year's race for seats is over.
There's no solution to the problems that the people face in either of these two parties. What we need to do is to really learn the lesson of the last number of years. Any progress that's been made for working people and for the oppressed in this country has come through the mass movements that have emerged. The current mass movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, is the latest example. You know, we've had wave after wave of struggle. A few years ago, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement. A few years before that, the immigrant rights movement. A few years before that, the movement against the war in Iraq. A few years before that, the mass protests that resulted and culminated in the shutdown of the World Trade Organization in Seattle. These mass movements are really where people need to look to for any hope that we can advance the interests of working people and the 99% against the 1%ers who run both of those political parties.
UN hypocrisy gets hysterical. Saudi Arabia is appointed to the UN Rights Panel. The United Nations, an international organization, its goal to promote peace and harmony and to prevent conflicts. Has the UN been able to serve its goal? It has ended various conflicts and wars. Some achievements: food programs across the world, like in Africa, negotiating peaceful settlements that have ended regional conflicts, and passage of various conventions and declarations on child and women. All noteworthy actions that deserve praise. But the appointment of Saudi Arabia to head a UN Human Rights Panel, that's UN hypocrisy going hysterical.
When we look at the structure of the United Nations, first off, we have to conclude that if the United Nations was set up to provide a forum to resolve conflict non-violently, and since it was formed in 1948, we can look at all of the wars and slaughters that have gone unpunished since 1948. The biggest culprits, of course, being the United States, and oftentimes Britain, its junior partner in this conquest of the world. We look at what the UN has done. Have they prosecuted? Have they created any kind of real policy to prevent the aggressive policies of war of the West? No, they have not. And in fact, we see that Britain and the United States are permanent members of the Security Council, as well as France. What has France, America, and Britain done for the Libyan people, or the Syrian people, or the Iraqi people, or the Afghani people for that matter? How many millions of tortured, of maimed, of killed, of refugees? How many do we need to see before we realize that it's our policies that are the most offensive to the world? It's not China, it's not Russia that's carrying out these policies, it's our Western nations that are doing this. And so therefore, we look at the United Nations and we see a completely dysfunctional organization. I don't actually believe the United Nations was truly set up to prevent war. I think it was set up to provide cover for the biggest violators around the world, the biggest war criminals in the world. Certainly, the record proves that they have indeed served that function.
Imagine that Saudi Arabia, one of the most authoritarian and human rights abusing nations on earth, even by UN standards, getting appointment to head a UN panel. Even on its website, the UN cites numerous rights violations committed by Saudi Arabia. Some examples: women not allowed to drive cars, torture by police and prison officials to be common, and lack of religious freedom are some of those violations in a long list in this report. So what gives? One reason could be the support of some Western nations, namely 3 of the UN veto-wielding members. the US, France and the UK. But the story doesn't end there. The fact that Saudi Arabia is on the UN Human Rights Council at all is more than sufficient to make a mockery out of the entire body. Yet Saudi Arabia is actually planning to take over the head position when the leadership position becomes available after 2016.
We've seen little sign in his first 7 months that King Salman is prepared to end long-standing abuses at home. Abroad, his country's air campaign against Houthi forces in Yemen, with US backing, has included indiscriminate attacks and the use of cluster munitions that may be war crimes.
We are the major supporters of Saudi Arabia. We are the ones who are selling them the weapons that they are using to slaughter the poorest people in the poorest nation in the Arab world, right now in Yemen. So who's a bigger human rights violator, Saudi Arabia or the United States and America, the major facilitators of Saudi Arabia, selling them arms and providing political cover while Saudi Arabia is funding these psychopaths who are running around chopping heads off of Christians and Muslims alike. So I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is worse than America or Britain. I think they are just a junior partner, and that America and Britain are actually the biggest human rights violators when you factor in the way they farm that out around the world.
David Weinberg, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and lead author of recent report on Saudi human rights abuses, said, "It's sadly ironic Saudi Arabia wants to be elected president of the Human Rights Council when its citizens aren't granted enough civil rights to even have a president or an elected prime minister." As world powers gather for the UN General Assembly's 70th anniversary, there should not be a sense of achievement for this body. After all, having Saudi Arabia appointed to a UN panel, a country responsible for the death of over 6,000 people in Yemen, that cannot be an achievement.
The problem in Yemen, I guess it will not be solved very, very soon, because everybody wants a zero solution, and there is no compromise solution up to now, and there is no common solution, political solution between the 3-4 parties are fighting each other in Yemen. So this is the problem. There is no one decision.
Here we find a Yemeni population which is being bombarded, even worse than Gaza was 2 summers ago. We find the Yemeni people being absolutely decimated by a vile and disgusting neighbor in Saudi Arabia, which is using Western weapons primarily supplied by Britain and America and other European nations as well. The United Nations has not only done nothing to curtail or stop the slaughter in Yemen, in fact, it's even provided cover in the form of resolutions effectively authorizing the Saudis to do what they're doing right now.
Then again, when it comes to the other failures like nuclear non-proliferation, the Syrian war, or the defeat of a resolution calling for the inspection of Israeli nuclear sites at the IAEA General Conference, the UN should take a close look in the mirror.
Israel's security woes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to Russia to meet President Vladimir Putin, almost 2 years since the last time he was in the Kremlin, and he brought along a high-caliber delegation of military and intelligence officials. An unprecedented move that is a clear indication of the importance of this visit to the Israelis. Just days ago, the news of an apparent Russian military buildup in Syria hit the headlines. That Moscow was moving aircraft, missiles, tanks and other military equipment to an airbase in western Syria. Putin does not deny this. In fact, he prides himself on defending a longtime ally, President Bashar Assad.
The question is not about whether...
The buildup is adding to Russia's frictions with the West that has for long trumpeted that Assad should go. Conflicts of interest resurfaced. Reactions poured in.
the last year and a half, we have said that Assad has to go, but how long, what the modality is, that's a decision that has to be made in the context of the Geneva process and negotiations. To the degree that Russia wants to focus its efforts against ISIL, we welcome that. And we're prepared to try to find the ways to most rapidly and most effectively eliminate ISIL. To do so is not to change one's position or attitude about what Assad has done to his own people, about the crimes that have been committed in the region. But it is to underscore the need for all of us to find a way to get to that elusive political settlement that we've talked about now for a period of time, but which has not yet materialized. There's an urgency, not just to fighting ISIL, there's an urgency to renewing everybody's effort to find the compromise that can produce the political settlement necessary to bring peace and stability to a Syria that is kept whole and secular, unified, where all minorities are protected.
If they were to overthrow President Assad and the Syrian government, Russia would lose all influence in the Middle East, because Syria and Russia are long-standing friends and allies, and through Syria, Russia has a lot of influence and power in the Middle East, no different to how America, through Saudi Arabia and through Israel, has a lot of power and influence in the Middle East. Secondly, the West and its regional allies want to overthrow the Syrian government and President Assad, because that would end Iranian influence in the Middle East.
This worried Israeli officials as well. Netanyahu wanted assurances from Putin that Russia's new role in the unfolding Syrian crisis would not compromise Israel's regional interests. Israel fears for its security. It fears Russia's advanced weaponry could end up in the hands of its sworn enemy Hezbollah, that according to Netanyahu is building a second terrorist front against Israel with the help of Iran from the Golan Heights.
Bashar Assad, the legitimate president of Syria, within any initiative will be part of political resolution of the Syrian problem.
In fact, it's been Israel's worst nightmare, to the extent that its fighter jets have violated Syrian airspace at least a dozen times to carry out airstrikes against arms cargoes allegedly bound for Hezbollah. Putin says the Syrian army and Syria as a whole are in such a state that they have no time for a second front, that the weapons are necessary for the fight against the collage of terrorist groups. But without Syrian boots on the ground, the West's coalition airstrikes against the Daesh are as futile as America's air campaign against the Taliban in Afghanistan back in early 2000s.
All of Russia's actions in the region have always been and will be very responsible. With regard to Syria, we all know that today the Syrian army and Syria itself are such a state that it can't open a second front. It needs to save its own statehood.
Moscow is acting within the framework of international law, respecting the sovereignty of our country and coordinating with the Syrian government. The United States does not do that. What they are doing is ineffective. The U.S. counts the number of airstrikes it carries out, but does not report on their results because their effectiveness is almost non-existent on the ground. In our opinion, there is no other force genuinely committed to fighting ISIL and al-Nusra Front effectively except for the Syrian army. This is essential in the fight against terrorism, and we welcome you to coordinate with us if you want these strikes to be effective. This is the core difference between the Russian and the U.S. actions.
The West is unhappy with the Russian military build-up in Syria because they believe that will ensure that the Syrian government, President Assad, but also the entire Syrian establishment will remain intact, and therefore Syria will not collapse and will not have a pro-Western, pro-Israeli government installed in Damascus. So that is why the West is so very, very concerned about Russia's military build-up in Syria, because ultimately it could very well deprive the West of what its of the objective it's trying to achieve and has been trying to achieve since 2011.
After the meeting, Putin and Netanyahu agreed to a joint mechanism for preventing misunderstandings between their forces in and around Syria. Israel wants to make sure there would be no unintended confrontation with Russia that Tel Aviv holds dear, especially after its relations with Washington grew daily more bitter over the nuclear deal with Tehran. This is clear as day. Israel is in a tight corner. It is no longer in perfect terms with its patron and its strategic ally, the US. And now it feels its position in the region is being threatened by Russia's direct involvement in Syria. Plus, in case Russia and the US end up cooperating militarily against the common enemy ISIL, Israel will be left out in the cold, and thus further isolated from the rest of the world. And lastly, with Russia emerging as a new player in the current crisis in the Middle East, Israel will not be the only one in possession of nuclear arsenals.